lesson looks at female emancipation, the background to women getting their full rights in American society. The Constitution of the United States provided equality for all citizens, men and women. However, the Supreme Court continuously holds through the 19th century that women are not in fact equal as it pertains to things like voting rights. And this is the largely what we're going to be talking about this particular lesson. So let's start with the background. Where does the female emancipation movement emerge out of? The first step towards women's equality and women getting the vote is what's known as the settlement house movement. You'll recall back when we were talking about the problems in inner cities, a woman named James Adam created what's known as the settlement house movement. Her famous work in Chicago dealing with poor and impoverished kids in the city brought a lot of women who otherwise would not be involved in politics or in helping in any form whatsoever into the public sphere. And women, as a result of a lot of things that started to happen in the Gilded Age, become a vital part of progressive achievements. Okay. They play an important role not only in the settlement house movement and furthering change for the poor in the inner cities. Okay, they get involved in a whole bunch of things that which become a quote unquote a side door to public life. Okay, middle class women through the settlement house movement, for instance, are exposed to the problems of American cities: poverty, crime, corruption, horrible working and living conditions. And this gives these places give women the skills and the confidence to begin to organize themselves and attack these evils. The second major one is the Women's Club. The Women's Club provide a broader moral incumbency entry point to civil life for the middle class women. These evolve out of what was very common throughout the 19th century as literary clubs. Literary clubs are where educated women would meet to discuss poetry and prose. They would read a Shakespearean work and get together and discuss the merits of that work, or the struggle between the protagonist and the antagonist, and so on and so forth. By the turn of the century, many of these clubs will begin to set aside poetry and prose and discuss the issues of the day. The president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs once said that Dante has been dead for several centuries. I think it is time that we women drop the study of his Inferno and turn our attention to our own Inferno, the problems that plague us. Effectively, he's saying, women, it's now time to focus on fixing yourselves. That was probably pretty obvious. Anyhow, thank you, Mr. Suter, for pointing that out. The look in which I got, I can only describe as condescending at best. Anyhow, organizations. There had always been the notion that women and men existed in separate spheres, and these separate spheres, women in the home and men outside the home, dictated that a woman's place was to do the traditional things, such as being a wife and being a mother, raising kids. However, progressive activism becomes concerned with moral issues that go outside of the home. Okay, they focus on issues, of course, somewhat attached to the issues that would worry a mother, such as they focus on things such as the working age of children, and women become among the biggest crusaders for the reduction of or the increase in the illegal working age to prevent children working in mills and mines. They become concerned about things like tuberculosis outbreaks, which disproportionately affect children in poor urban areas and slums and tenements, like the tenements in New York, et cetera, et cetera. They become concerned about pensions. So if they have a husband who are the primary breadwinner at this particular time, injured, or disabled, or killed in industrial action, at this particular point, women were not entitled to the pension of their deceased husband. That is, the money that they had saved for their retirement. That would sort of go back into the pot. At this point, the women want these pensions to be guaranteed to the mothers with dependent children. And of course, because another one of their primary roles was feeding the family, they were concerned about safe food products. The horrors of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, for instance, are particularly prescient for women, who become among the greatest campaigners in the early part of the 20th century for food inspection laws and health standards for food products. There are several organizations which women will use. Many of them are small, but they will all give female reformers, some of whom become quite big names, a national stage for their advocacy. The first one is the National Consumers League. The second, the Women's Trade Union League. The third is the Children's Bureau, and lastly, the Women's Bureau. The last two actually become federal agencies, which employ women as their heads, which is actually quite a step forward during the progressive era, so that there are federal agencies and government bodies that are looking after both the rights of children and the rights of women.
Okay, so moving on to their successes. You'll notice that their initial successes are not political. This is partly because to get political reform is much harder, much bigger, and requires almost to persuade men that women are equal on some level. Whereas labour laws and laws around women's working and women's working conditions are easier to persuade. This is because women's reformers, particularly the successor ones, realise that they're not going to persuade men that women are equal to men. But if they exploit man's preconception that women need to be looked after, women need to be weaker and frailer, and they're more likely to be exploited, and then they make it about a simple moral story, we just need to look after these people, stop them getting exploited, then you're far more likely to persuade men, who are the only ones who can vote and therefore have the power, to accept certain reforms. So what we see is in the initial stages, the women's movement really starts to focus on labour conditions, women's welfare, as opposed to political reform per se, because it's more achievable and it will help get the organisation going. And when they do this, they always emphasise the sort of paradigm, traditional ideas of gender, and in order and use that almost men's preconception of gender to try and get men to accept reforms. Florence Kelly, for example, becomes one of the first real advocates for this sort of stuff, and becomes Illinois' first chief factory inspector, designed to go around to the various sweatshops in the area which tended to employ low-wage, low-skilled women in, for example, garment trade or various other trades, to improve those factory conditions. And this is particularly the case when she takes control of the National Consumers League. And what this does is really pushes for safeguards, laws, regulations, mostly on the local level, but then increasingly on a national level, designed to protect poor, helpless women from their own being exploited by rough, dominant men and their bosses. So, for example, Miller versus Oregon, there is a case which argues that it is constitutional to have laws which limit what governments and what businesses can do in how they treat their workers, because women are weaker and therefore they must be looked after, because a factory work is particularly harmful. Now, in reality, Kelly didn't really believe this. Kelly was a fairly strong liberal feminist and therefore believed in true equality. But if you want to get change, you need to sort of play to the crowd, and if all the powers of the men need to play with what you want to hear. This is a particularly good example of that. Now, this was actually later thrown out in by a higher court, but really did set a precedent, the idea that there was this idea that women should be looked after to some extent because of their weaknesses politically but also physically. And what we see really emerges on the progressive movement is the American welfare state. And the American welfare state really comes into fruition as a result of progressive movement. But if you look at what they do, it's all about protecting children and women. And because these people need to be protected, it appeals to the men's natural sense of like women as inferior but also weak and almost childlike. And we see very little reforms to help men, especially who are unemployed or sick, for example. And this is particularly important, and it shows a real success and political savviness on the part of female activists. We do see some setbacks. Laws, for example, on a local level, limiting bakers to 10-hour days were reversed, but by 1917 we see this 10-hour day being enforced for factory workers. Very important that factory work was predominantly and increasingly a woman's role because it's low skill, low pay, whereas the men tended to focus on either skilled work or work requiring strength, for example, longshoremen, people taking their stuff from docks, or miners, which was still very limited to men. So therefore, as well as that, we also see increasing laws on factory safety. Now, despite all these local level reforms, and they were successful reforms, in reality, it's one thing having a law, another thing enforcing the law. And to enforce the law requires a government body, either on a state or federal level, to have the numbers, which cost money, the power, and the inclination to go into businesses and tell them that they're not following the rules. In reality, since most big businesses had lent money to or donated money or quite important, and most Republicans and even Democrats were unwilling to really start involving themselves in business because of rugged individualism, we see that these laws are not enforced. And this is most commonly seen in the terrible fire at this Triangle Shirtwaist Company, which got 146 workers, particularly women workers who work in the garment trade, who, because the bosses did not trust the women not to try and walk out or to have to chat or to have a break, they locked the fire doors, and while the bosses escaped, or most of us escaped, the women were locked in, and therefore many died, including many who jumped out windows and left to their death, because it's better to jump outside and try and survive than burn inside. This became a huge issue, and we really brought attention to both the women's plight in working conditions, but also the failure of existing legislation, and really garner support from women, but also progressives, for greater reform for women. It is not an accident that the garment fire primarily killed women. It really echoes those ideas again, that women need to be protected by the laws because they can't do it themselves. That conceit is not true necessarily, but it works for the politics. We therefore see, linked to this and sort of the same sort of thing, strikes in the needle trade and other low skill work, which leads to stronger laws regulating hours worked. Partly because, yes, it's an important trade, but mostly because they have a moral argument which striking men don't have. Men are more likely to believe the arguments that women need to be protected, and therefore it works. And we see the success in this, but by 1917, 30 states have compensation laws providing benefits to those injured in industrial accidents, particularly those with active women's groups. Women both who get injured at work benefit from this, but also women who are married to husbands who get injured. The entire family suffer if they're particularly staying at home. And what we see, therefore, is that gradually, because of the application and the arguments of women campaigners, there's this idea that employers are to some extent have a responsibility to society, and particularly their own workers. It's not just you take your wages and go, really starts to come to fruition.
Now, just a couple pictures on Triangle Shirtwaist. Interestingly enough, that building which you see on fire, which is the one where the Triangle Shirtwaist fire happened, is actually still standing, and you can visit it today if you find yourself in New York City. It's in the Upper West Side, around 8th Street, somewhere around there. Anyways, you can go see it. These are pictures of women who lived to their death from the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, and strikes and protests that happened in New York subsequently, effectively because of it. Now, another major success that women had was pushing forward the temperance movement. Of course, we talked about this in good detail in the last lesson on prohibition, but you've got to remember that at the grassroots level, in the day-to-day fight for temperance, not happening in Congress, women were probably, and actually not probably, undoubtedly the largest proponents of the temperance movement. Of course, alcohol, in the eyes of women, was intimately connected with a whole bunch of ills in which they fought to prevent, such as prostitution in red light districts, drunken voters who would vote for the right people, political corruption, the drunken boss, and the concept that there were rigged elections, including something famously known as a cemetery vote, which women protested against, and that's the notion that the dead people were voting in these rigged elections. They were quite successful. For example, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement becomes the largest women's group in the entire world. Its leader, Frances Willard, one of the leading proponents of temperance, would walk into saloons, fall on her knees and pray. She got 1 million women to commit to making the world more homelike. And of course, there was lots to be worried about. For instance, New York and San Francisco had one bar per 200 people in 1900. And of course, the dangers in urban areas that far outweighed that in rural areas. The temperance movement itself and the women's Christian temperance movement, as we've talked about last time, will ally with the very powerful and politically savvy Anti-Saloon League, which leads to, of course, in very much as a consequence of women's actions, half of Americans living by 1914 in quote-unquote dry areas. Of course, cities generally remain wet as the immigrant population are more accustomed to old country traditions, i.e. drinking and booze, but nevertheless, there is huge progress made towards temperance as a result of women. The other major success, of course, is suffrage. During the First World War, women will use the platform of the war to improve themselves. And this is not only true of America, to improve themselves, to improve their political standing. This is not only true of America, this is true of Great Britain, it's true of Canada, it's true of a lot of other countries. The war will split the women's movement. Firstly, many progressive women are pacifists. They were opposed to America's participation of war, and they were also opposed to women getting involved in the war effort. One of the best examples is the Quakers, who are a pacifist group themselves, and the National Women's Party, led by a woman named Alice Paul. They'll demonstrate against Kaiser Wilson, a shot at the President Woodrow Wilson, who puts America into the war against Germany and their Kaiser, their king, in 1917. They'll use marches and hunger strikes to do that. However, the other half of the women's movement will support the war, and this will be led by a group known as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This group will say that we will support the war and argue that women must take part in the war effort in order to have a role in shaping the peace. And what they meant by that is, as a trade-off for us supporting the war, working in factories and doing the things the men who have gone to fight in the front used to do, we will do this in exchange for our suffrage, our right to vote. Therefore, they tied intimately the fight for democracy abroad to their best hope ever for winning true democracy and equality at home. So in many cases, the First World War it leads to suffrage. In fact, it's very important to note that Woodrow Wilson was no fan of the women's movement whatsoever. Actually, for a progressive president, he has many limits. We've talked, and we will talk about the fact that Woodrow Wilson was massive racist, no friend to black people and civil rights. He's also no friend to women. In fact, he'll campaign against women's suffrage in 1912. However, during the war, he becomes, quote unquote, impressed with women's participation, is willing to give in to the vote in regards to the war effort.
So how does it eventually turn out to become a full-on vote? Because obviously the inherent problem here is you need to get men who benefit from being the only voters to accept and get their representatives to vote, give women the right to vote. Now, as mentioned before, yes, women impress Wilson as part of the war effort. I would say that's a little bit of a misnomer. I think that's a very helpful rhetorical device, but in reality, women worked just as much before the war, and in reality, it's a convenient moral excuse, and it's certainly a moral excuse. Campaigners for the vote said, well, we've worked the war effort, we're just as patriotic, it should give it to us. But I don't think that convinced many people. The real effects are political. The real effects to make someone make such a fundamental change so quickly are part of a broader political calculation. So what we see is a couple of things. Women voters are already starting to get the right to vote, with local states giving themselves the right, giving women the right to vote. New York in 1917, Michigan, Oklahoma, and South Dakota, for example. And so already, if you start being the president who resists women getting the right to vote, you're going to lose their vote and you're going to lose those states. So already now there's a thing where you need to make sure your party appeals to the women's vote, at least in those states, in order to carry on getting votes in those states. But that means you need to support women's rights to vote. So already there's this pressure from below that parties need to be more accommodating to win votes in those states. And it's clear that further states will follow this. So already there's this consideration of, well, we're already taking the platform, states are already doing it, should we just go away and do it before we just annoy women voters and lose their vote for a generation? Because they fear that if the Democrats are anti-women's vote and Republicans are pro-women's votes, women will naturally be biased for that entire generation towards Republicans. And that's 50% of the population. That's not great to annoy. So there's this sort of worry and fear that it's going to happen anyway. We need to be on the right side of this. As well as this, in 1918, for very similar reasons, Britain, Austria, Hungary, Germany all extend the suffrage to women. And there's this image that the society in the Western worlds are increasingly becoming more enlightened and more democratic. And so again, there's this feeling of this is something that's naturally going to happen. It's happening anyway. It's inevitable. Be on the right side of history. Additionally, not quite mentioned there is related to this is the calculation that there are many increasing poor, there's many increasing Irish, etc., etc. Machine politics isn't great, but by having women voters, women voters tend to be more family oriented, tend to be more conservative and religious. Actually, this will help offset some of the effects of immigrants and some of the effects of cities and some of the effects of blacks who are increasingly getting the right to vote. So there's this sort of conservative reform sense of it. That actually women who are far more pliant will listen to their husbands will offset this increasing leftward shift in American society. That's to some extent been shown to be true. In fact, on average, the women voters tend to be more socially conservative but economically liberal than their partners. So this all adds up to 1920, with the 19th Amendment ratified, giving all women, American women, the right to vote, unless you're black or Native American or poor. America!
So what's the reality? One of the things it would be incorrect to say is that what women gained in wartime lasted forever. Most of these gains were fleeting. There's a women's bureau, as I mentioned, it's created in 1920 to deal with women's issue. The Department of Labor oversees the Women's Bureau, and this is meant to protect women in the workplace. What we see, though, however, is at the end of the war, most women actually leave the workplace and return to the homes when the war is over, yielding the jobs that they had worked throughout the war and the gains they had made back to men. Congress will come through in what's known as the Shepherd's Towner Maternity Act and reinforce that they see and they envision that in America, the traditional role of women should be maintained as mothers. And this gives federally financed instruction to mothers, which reinforce things that their maternal priorities are for infant health care and keeping a good home. It also expands the role of the federal government in family welfare. Therefore, the federal government, if it's being more involved in family welfare, can dictate what they consider the proper family to be. So what we see here is that World War I in the Progressive era, though not a complete success, demonstrate that women's labor, effectively, the fact that they were working, could be turned into political power, and this could, to a degree, shape America, but not totally.
Bye.